Hello everyone, welcome to the galleries of USS Constitution Museum. My name is Jim, this is my friend Susan. And today we're going to be telling you a great story. A story, of course, about USS Constitution that we call Anatomy of Victory. In this story, we want to find out what it was that made USS Constitution such a great and successful ship in its day. And in order to tell that story, first we have to set a little background for you, particularly what things were like in 1794 when USS Constitution first began to be built. So to imagine the United States at that time, it was a brand new country. It had come off of a long war for independence from Great Britain and had been victorious. It was a new nation. It had recently ratified a brand new constitution. And for the most part, being a new nation was for the best. Things were very good. But in one way, there was a great disadvantage. Merchants here in New England and across the new United States for years had been able to rely on the support of the British Navy. That means that when their ships would cross the Atlantic and go to other ports, they didn't have to worry so much about pirates and about other foreign nations attacking their ships, because the British Navy, the largest and best in the world with hundreds of ships, would be there to protect them. Well, once independence from Great Britain had been achieved, that navy was gone. And in fact, the United States, for its first few years, decided not to have a navy at all. And what that meant was that ships from this part of the world began to be attacked. Pirates would attack them and take all of their precious cargo. Sometimes foreign navies would attack the ships and impress or kidnap some of those sailors and enroll them in their own navies. Something had to be done about that. Now, what do you suppose you would have done? You can imagine the expense of this navy, and some men in Congress decided they did not want to pay for a navy. But in 1794, a majority of congressmen agreed it was time for a navy, and they passed the Naval Act of that year. They allocated money so that new ships could be built. Now, there wouldn't be a lot of ships in this navy. It would never be the size of the British Navy, not for many decades. In fact, at the start, there was only enough money for 6 ships. So think about that for a moment. What sort of ships would you design? What would they look like? What would they be made out of? Those were the important questions. And to tell us a bit about how they came up with those answers at that time in 1794, I'll turn things over to Susan.
Thanks, Jim. So a unique aspect of USS Constitution was that she was designed to both outrun and outgun the enemy. So what that means is that it was fast and maneuverable enough to get away from larger ships that were much more heavily armed, and yet was a bit more heavily armed than some of the comparable or smaller ships. So to give you an example of that, we've got this model here. You can see, again, it's a little bit smaller and quicker than this larger example here on the top, and yet just a bit bigger and more armed than this bottom example. For this reason, we sometimes refer to USS Constitution as the Goldilocks of ships. She's just right, which is a great strategic place to be. So another aspect of the design, we heard Jim talk about this very small navy that they were beginning with. They had to be very thoughtful about the materials that they were using to get the best bang for their buck. So they were really thinking about what they were using to make these ships to be the best that they could be. So I've got some examples of materials here. We note that the ship was made out of wood down on the bottom. The hull of the ship, or this body down beneath, is made out of wood. Now, I actually have 2 types of wood with me here. I have a piece of white oak and a piece of live oak. They look pretty similar. They're about the same size, shape. They look pretty similar, but they do have some differences. So if you look closely, we have the white oak has a bit of a straight grain to it, and yet this live oak has a very gnarled grain to it. And actually what I can feel, if you could imagine at home, is that this live oak is very heavy, it's very dense. And this is a really important piece of the construction. Again, these were actually both used in the construction of USS Constitution. And if you'll imagine, does anyone at home like Oreo cookies? I know I'll speak for myself, I certainly do. But think about that construction of them. So the 2 outer layers, those cookie layers, would be like that white oak. And then that special cream filling on the inside would be like the live oak. Again, it's very strong, very dense, and that's what actually helps earn the nickname and the fame of USS Constitution. So during a battle, someone noticed that cannonballs were hitting the side of the ship, but instead of penetrating through, one actually fell back out into the water. Someone saw this happen and they said, "Huzzah, her sides are made of iron." Again, they are not in fact made out of iron. We know they are made out of very strong wood, but that nickname really stuck. We'll hear a bit more about that success later. So we've heard a little bit about the need for a Navy, the design and thinking that went into that and the materials, but you need an important piece of the puzzle to make this all work, to make the ship run. You need people, you need a crew. So I'm gonna hand it back over to Jim to put that together for us.
Thank you, Susan, for telling us about the materials in this ship. And before we head upstairs, I'd like you all to take one last look at this model that we have here of the ship and think about the ship as an amazing piece of technology, a very complicated piece of technology. Look at all of those sails. Look at all of those lines, what when they're not on the ship we would call ropes. And think about each rope and each sail having a different job to do and how hard it would be to figure out how this all works together. And think about the sort of crew member you might want running the ship. Think about that a bit as we head up the stairs. Hello everyone again. And here we are in front of what we call our House of Rendezvous, which was a recruiting place for the ship. And here we have our recruiting officer who has the job of finding people to work on board this vessel. So how much recruiting do you suppose he has to do? How many crew members do you think were on this ship? Think about that for a moment. Well, if you're thinking about 450, that was the answer. It's a complicated machine with a lot of moving parts. You need a lot of men to operate that vessel. So our recruiting officer, who is he looking for? Who are these 450 people? Well, let's start by focusing on our officer. Now, on board this ship, maybe upwards of 40 people were officers of one kind or another. Some of them were there because they had special skills. Others were part of the chain of command. And a lot of them would have started life as what was called a midshipman. Now, a midshipman is a kind of junior officer. They typically join when they're teenagers, and you don't need to go out recruiting them. They will send in their applications for this very competitive job. Now, who's the sort of person who wants to join the ranks of the officers? Well, if you guess that this person probably came from a wealthy background, the answer is yes, probably from established families who are able to make the preparations necessary to give their child a bit of training for this rank. They're not the wealthiest either, because this is the sort of job where you can at least start to earn money early and be set on a career path. Now, according to the law, anyone who wanted to be an officer had to be born in the United States and be an American citizen. There was a great fear that particularly former officers from the British Navy might want these jobs, and suddenly the United States Navy would not actually be run by Americans. We also know that while it was not officially illegal for someone who was not white to take this job, we have no record of anyone becoming an officer who was African American. So we can get a picture of what these officers look like, but the other members of the crew would have looked a bit different. Let's stroll over here and take a look at this fellow. Now, here we have an officer, but you can immediately see it's a different sort of officer. He has a totally different uniform on. He is a Marine lieutenant, and he'd have the job of recruiting some Marines. But what is a Marine exactly, say at the time of the War of 1812? Well, it's not exactly a sailor. They don't do the sorts of things that sailors do. They are fighting men. They have to be a certain height. We want tall, big men who are very strong, and men who know how to operate guns. And in this case, I do mean smaller weapons, not cannons, as Susan will talk to you about a little bit later. There are about 50 of these men altogether. During a battle, they will be the ones who will be acting as sharpshooters up in the fighting tops, or they will be leading the boarding movement onto another ship. And otherwise, they're spending their time on board the ship as the ship's police force. And you might wonder, who exactly are these police guarding? Well, that would be everybody else. And everybody else would be Navy sailors. So let's stroll this way and take a look at this fellow. Here we have somebody who is perhaps joining the Navy to be a sailor. And what could we say about him? Well, first of all, do you remember that big model down there? Remember how complicated it was? Remember how you probably needed a bit of skill to figure out how this machine worked? Well, that's exactly who we're looking for to become sailors. Chances are this recruit has spent time on board a ship. And in fact, the best of them, who had spent probably about 3 years on board a ship at least, would be able seamen. They were the highest paid men on board the ship outside of the officers. Just below them would be a group called an ordinary seaman. But the ordinary seamen, well, they're not inexperienced either. Chances are they've had at least 1 year of experience on board a ship. And just below them are what would be called boys. And when I say boy, I don't mean they were kids. Don't have that picture in your mind. Instead, a boy was simply somebody who had very little experience at all. So altogether, you have this skilled crew of men who know how this very complicated machine is operating. And in order to find these skilled people, you will pick anybody, no matter where they come from. So unlike for the officers, there was no law that you had to be a citizen. And maybe about 40% of the US Navy at this time are foreign-born people who are not citizens of the United States. Although serving on board a ship like USS Constitution for them was one pathway to citizenship. And maybe about 15% or more of the crew was African American. For while they were denied places in the officer class, they were among the most skilled sailors working in America at the time. So compared to our officers, this group would have been speaking in different accents, perhaps in different languages, and the complexion of their skin would have varied significantly. But what united them all was a desire to work on board this ship, because unlike in the British Navy, to join the Navy, you simply had to want to be in that Navy. No one would be kidnapped or impressed into service. And in fact, when the War of 1812 started, one of the rallying cries was free trade and sailors' rights. These sailors were fighting to defend their own rights. So I think Susan is interested in telling us a bit about what these sailors did on board the ship. So why don't you come with me now and we'll see if we can find her. Here's one of our sailors, by the way. You may have noticed our sailor did not have a fancy uniform. The sailors weren't even given a uniform. They had to provide their own clothes, and all of their belongings had to fit into a sea bag like this. I hope this fellow packed properly. And while one sad aspect of joining the Navy was that you had to leave your family behind, the good news for this family is that the sailor who's just joined the Navy might have signed a document like this, indicating that at least part of his pay will go home to the family. So joining the Navy isn't just a way to serve your country, it is a way to provide some funds as well for the family. And look, it's Susan. Hello, Susan. You're going to tell us a bit about what the sailors did on board the ship?
I will. Hi again. So we are on our recreation of the spar deck, or the top deck of the ship. And we just heard Jim talk a little bit about the makeup of the crew. And two aspects in my mind that helped to make the crew so successful were teamwork and practice. So behind me there's a depiction of Captain Isaac Hull, who was captain at the beginning of the War of 1812. It was so important for him to have a well-trained and practiced crew so that they worked as a well-oiled machine. So two examples of that were managing the guns, having gun crews, but then also sail handling, which we'll talk about in just a moment. So to start out with the guns, we have an example of a carronade here. Constitution had two types of guns, a carronade, a bit smaller, and then long guns. Again, this one is an example of a carronade. Kind of a fun fact is that on land, they're referred to as cannons, but on a ship, they're referred to as guns. You may hear me use either term, so just kind of a fun piece. But they're, right off the bat, you'll notice that they're very large. So this carronade could weigh about a ton. That's huge. One person just simply cannot operate that by themselves. It took a team of about 9 to 14 men working together, each with specific tasks and roles, following a sequence of steps. It was very important that everyone knew what their job was and was working together. A well-trained crew could fire their gun in about 90 seconds, which is really impressive. Another interesting tidbit is that Captain Hull had them practice with live ammunition, so they knew exactly what to expect. He didn't want any surprises, so they were well prepared when it came to that. I mentioned before sail handling was another aspect of their training. So if you'll join me over here, we'll take a look at that. So we have our recreation of the yard. On board the ship, the yard is a horizontal piece that connects perpendicular to the mast. This is where the sails are on board a ship. So on a sailing vessel, this is the engine of USS Constitution, if you will. So this is so important to operating the ship. And this could be 100 or 200 feet up, where sailors were climbing up into the air to maneuver this and adjust it. The largest sail on board the ship was the size of an NBA basketball court, which is huge. So that could take about 50 men to manage that as well. Keep in mind, this is happening during rain, snow, sleet, wind, all sorts of different harsh conditions. So this was a hard job. So think for a moment for yourself. Are you afraid of heights? Is this a job you would be willing to do? I know I'll speak for myself. That would be quite a challenge. I'll leave it at that. How about you, Jim? Are you feeling brave? Are you feeling like you could give this a try?
Oh yeah, I'll do it.
All right, show us your bravery. So you can step on board the rope here, the foot rope, and you lean over and kind of rest your belly on board on it, and you lift that sail up bit at a time, and ultimately you're tying it off with a knot to keep it nice and secure. This is called furling the sail. Excellent. Looking great. Well done, well done. So with this act of bravery, Jim has successfully tied up the sails, and I'll hand it back to tie up our thoughts. So we've heard a bit about the design of the ship, a well-trained crew. So far it's sounding like a recipe for success.
Thanks so much, Susan. So I know you've all been watching this video. You've heard about what a wonderful piece of technology the ship was, how they got the best sailors that they could, and Susan's just told us about how they were all training together and cooperating. So it shouldn't be a surprise to you at this point that the ship was a great success, and it first showed its success on August 19th of 1812. On that day in the North Atlantic, there was an encounter between USS Constitution and a British ship called the HMS Guerriere. And Constitution had a victory on that day. Not only was it a victory, it was a victory that was over in about a half an hour. Guerriere was decimated. And it was on that occasion, as Susan told us before, that the ship earned its nickname of Old Ironsides, when a sailor was said to have shouted out, "Huzzah, her sides are made of iron," as a cannonball bounced off the side. Now, it's no surprise to you because you've heard all about this, but for people in the United States at the time, for many of them, this was a great surprise indeed. They had grown up believing that the British Navy was absolutely invincible. So to know that an American ship was capable of such a victory against this invincible enemy, well, it was shocking and amazing. And many people across the United States felt a great gratitude towards the United States Navy. The Navy itself became one of the great unifying institutions of the United States. And in fact, I can show you an example of that gratitude right over here. Here we have what back then they would have called an urn, but you might think of it as a punch bowl. And you could have quite a party with this one. This is perhaps the largest silver punch bowl of its kind made in America up to that point. It was a gift from the citizens of Philadelphia who had subscribed and raised their money to have it created for Captain Isaac Hull. And take a look at it. If you look right in the center there, what do you see? It's in fact USS Constitution defeating HMS Guerriere. And there were other gifts from people all over the United States in honor of Captain Hull, some of which you can find in this museum today. And Captain Hull would not be the only one who would be the recipient of such generosity. Just a few months after the battle with the Guerriere, there was another battle, this time with the HMS Java, and once again, USS Constitution proved victorious, this time under Captain William Bainbridge. And then, towards the end of the War of 1812, in 1815, there would be a third victory. This time, under Captain Charles Stewart, USS Constitution would defeat not one, but two British vessels at once, the Cyane and the Levant. People in the United States were so impressed by this ship that some even argued at this time it should be preserved forever. But USS Constitution had a lot more service to give to this country, and would do so through the end of the 19th century. In the 20th century, though, the ship was not in the best condition, but it found a permanent home here in the Charlestown Navy Yard. And over the years, those people who had called for the restoration of the ship succeeded. They raised the money, and the ship is today here in the Navy Yard, fully preserved, the ship of state of the United States of America. And today, through this anatomy of victory, I hope that Susan and I have shown you just why this ship became such a symbol of the United States Navy and of the United States. Thank you so much for joining us here today.